Well, hello there. I'm Gemini.
All right, let's talk business expenses. When you think about what you can write off, what comes to mind? Probably stuff like a new laptop, right? Or maybe a plane ticket for a work trip. And of course, fuel for a company car. That's a classic. But what about fuel for the human body? Yeah, I know, it sounds a little out there. But today, we are going to unpack this incredible Canadian legal case that asked that exact question. Can your lunch actually be a business expense? Believe me, the answer completely turned the rules on their head.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll meet the courier who made this wild claim. Then we'll look at the old school law that basically said no way. After that, we'll explore the brilliant fuel for the body argument he used, see how the court came up with a really clever new test to handle it, and finally, we'll talk about why this one single case is still such a big deal today.
Okay, so our story doesn't start in some stuffy courtroom. It starts out on the busy streets of Toronto, and our main character is a guy whose job was, well, let's just say it was intense. He was a self-employed courier, and his daily hustle was about to put the entire tax code on notice.
So let's just try to picture this guy's day. I mean, the physical demand here is unbelievable. This was not your typical 9 to 5. He was a courier, sure, but he did it all on foot or by public transit. And get this, he was covering a staggering 150 kilometers, that's over 90 miles every single day, all across Toronto, all while lugging a backpack that could weigh anywhere from 20 to 50 pounds. We're talking 10-hour days, and the real kicker? It was all commission-based. If you didn't move, he didn't get paid.
To actually make a living, he had to operate like a finely tuned machine. His day would kick off before 7 in the morning and wouldn't wrap up until 6 at night. He was just in constant motion, running through downtown, jumping on and off subways, walking for miles, all to deliver as many packages as he possibly could as fast as he could. His entire income was a direct result of his physical output. So to keep this human machine running, he made an argument. He said his body needed way more fuel than the average person's. Now, he wasn't trying to write off his entire grocery bill. He was very specific. He claimed about $11 a day for what he called extra food and water, the additional fuel his body absolutely had to have just to do his job, way more than what a regular person would need.
Now, as you've probably guessed, the Canada Revenue Agency wasn't exactly thrilled with this idea. When he filed his taxes, they shot it down immediately. And you know what? From a legal standpoint, they were kind of right, at least based on a rule that had been on the books forever. Yep, the Tax Court of Canada basically said, nice try, but no. Their logic was super simple and honestly pretty standard. They ruled that the money he spent on food and water was a personal expense, not a business one. Case closed. Or so it seemed.
So the legal brick wall he hit is a very specific part of the law, paragraph 18(1)(h) of the Income Tax Act. It's the part that says you can't deduct personal or living expenses, and what could possibly be more personal than food and water, right? The thinking goes like this. Everybody has to eat to live, whether you're at work or sitting on your couch. It's just a fundamental cost of being a human, not a cost of running a business.
But this is where it gets interesting. The courier's appeal boiled down to this really simple but kind of profound question. Okay, sure, everyone needs to eat. But is the extra food someone needs to power their body for extreme physical labor really the same thing as just, grabbing lunch? Or is it something else entirely? Something that looks a lot more like fuel for an engine? And this, my friends, is where the whole case takes a brilliant turn. When he appealed to the federal court, his argument was reshaped around an analogy. An analogy is so simple, so logical, and so powerful that it made the judges stop and rethink that entire 100-year-old rule.
The whole thing was built on this beautiful comparison. Picture two couriers. They're in the exact same business, right? Delivering packages. Courier number 1 drives a car. The fuel for their car, the gasoline, is without question a deductible business expense. Nobody argues with that. Now, courier number 2 uses their own body as their vehicle. So the fuel for their vehicle, that extra food and water, was being denied. The question was, why should the tax law treat these two identical businesses so different?
And check this out. This quote is straight from the court's decision. It shows you just how perfectly that argument landed. The judges got it instantly. You have two people doing the exact same business activity. The only real difference was the type of engine being used. One was internal combustion, the other was human. So why was this so powerful? Well, it totally changed the conversation. It wasn't about him choosing to have a big lunch for fun. It was about him needing that extra fuel as a business necessity, just to get the job done. This idea also levels the playing field for different ways of doing business, and as a nice little bonus, it actually supports more environmentally friendly kinds of work.
So the federal court was sold on the logic, but they now had a massive problem on their hands. If they say yes to this guy, does that mean everyone can start writing off their lunch? They had to figure out a way to agree with the courier without, blowing up the entire tax system.
This right here was the court's biggest fear. It's what lawyers call the floodgates argument. If this one courier can deduct his food, then what's stopping a construction worker who does heavy lifting, or a brain surgeon who burns a lot of calories thinking? Where on earth do you draw the line?
And what they came up with was, frankly, genius. They laid out a three-step solution. First, they said, you know what? That floodgates concern is totally valid. Second, they built a super specific test based on that amazing car versus human courier analogy. And third, they laid out exactly how this test would work in the real world.
This is the test in action, and it makes so much sense. Okay, let's take a rickshaw driver. Does their job directly correspond to another type of business that deducts fuel for a machine? Yes, a taxi driver who deducts gasoline. So, under this test, the rickshaw driver's extra food could be allowed. Now, what about a construction worker? Even though their work is incredibly demanding, there isn't really a corresponding job where someone uses a machine and deducts fuel to do the exact same task. So, for the construction worker, the deduction is not allowed.
And there you have it, the brand new Bright Line test. It created this very narrow, very specific exception to the old rule. You can only deduct extra food as body fuel if you can point to someone else doing your exact job with a machine who gets to write off their fuel. It was just a perfect, clean, logical solution.
So, what was the final verdict? Well, it was a bit of a split decision. The Federal Court of Appeal said yes, the legal principle was sound. They agreed that, in theory, this courier should be able to deduct his extra food, but they kicked the case back down to the original tax court to sort out the messy details, the facts. It was now up to that lower court to decide if he really needed all that extra fuel and exactly how much money was reasonable to deduct. As one judge amusingly pointed out, no deductions for fancy bottled water when tap water would do the job.
So, okay, it's a great story about one guy and his $11 a day claim, but why are we still talking about it? Because this case, Scott v. Canada, created a really important precedent. It's a perfect example of how our laws can actually evolve to keep up with the modern world of work.
The legacy here is actually pretty profound. This case forced the law to acknowledge the physical reality of the gig economy. It proved that old, rigid rules aren't set in stone. They can be challenged and updated. It managed to do this by creating a smart, targeted exception that didn't break the system. And in the process, it put greener, human-powered businesses on a more equal footing with their machine-powered counterparts.
This really sums up the whole journey perfectly. You start with this absolute black and white rule, all food is personal. End of story. Then you get this one bold claim arguing that, hey, maybe some food is for business. And where we land is this new, smarter rule, where a tiny, but very logical, exception was carved out for a very specific type of work.
And all of this leaves us with a really fascinating question to think about. As the world of work keeps changing, with remote work, the gig economy, AI, what's the next thing that we all consider a purely personal expense today that might just become an essential and maybe even a deductible business necessity tomorrow?